Hi there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay from SpeechKids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their little kids. And today I'm thrilled to be talking to Meredith Polsky. Meredith, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Will you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a social worker at Growing Minds, which is a private practice based here in Rockville, Maryland. And I specialize in selective mutism. I work with other children and families as well around mood disorders and emotional regulation and all kinds of things, that go on for young children and their parents. But my personal sweet spot, my professional sweet spot is children and teens with selective mutism.
And I'm going to ask you before we go any further, what is selective mutism and how does it manifest?
Great question. So, selective mutism is actually a really unique disorder of childhood, and it's really rooted in anxiety. And basically, what happens is that children who are able to speak perfectly normally at home, so they do have language, their language has developed typically, um, are only able to sometimes use that language in the comfort of their own home. So when they go to other places where they're expected to speak, like school, like play dates, other activities or social situations, they're actually unable to use their voice. They're very much sort of frozen in terms of their ability to speak, and oftentimes even in terms of their ability to engage at all. And so yeah, it's a really unique situation for some children.
Can you say, because I know there are a number of parents who will watch this and say, well, clearly they just don't want to speak, or they're shy, or they're being stubborn. Can you tease that out a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And you just hit on several myths that are, really, really popular when it comes to selective mutism, because it is so difficult to wrap our heads around the fact that a child is just not able to speak in certain situations, knowing that that child is verbal. So, I'll touch on the piece about being shy first. So I think a lot of parents and even parents of children with selective mutism do tend to sort of put that label on their children as being shy. What I've actually found with most of the children I've worked with selective mutism is that their sort of like core personality actually is not shy at all, right? It's like something very different that's going on.
Yeah.
Most parents of children with selective mutism will tell you that at home, their selectively mute child is actually their most rambunctious, oftentimes the most challenging, oftentimes the most opinionated, and probably would not describe for the most part them as being shy. But it's also a label that other people place on their kids, right? So if you imagine walking down the street and you run into your friend and you're having a conversation and the friend asks your child a question and the child doesn't answer, it's very likely that that friend is going to say, "Oh, she's just being shy," or, "Oh, you're feeling shy today, aren't you?" So it's very much sort of like a label that's imposed by other people, and I find doesn't always really or even usually represent sort of that core of the child. But certainly I can't blame anybody for that, because that's definitely, how it comes across. And then that piece about being, stubborn or manipulative or controlling. So that's something also that I think kids with selective mutism really get a bad rap about. And I always give the example, if you told a typical 3 or 4 or 5 year old, like, we're going to play a game, you're going to go to school and you're not going to talk all day, right? Like, they're not going to be able to do it, right? And so it's this thing that happens that I think to these children feels very physical. And I've even had children describe it to me as feeling like the words are stuck in their throat. They know what they want to say and they just can't get the words out. And, there are things that young children do in order to sort of control an environment that they have very little control over. So we might see, toileting issues. We might see food issues. But speaking, using our voice is really not one of those things that children use to exercise control. And if these children could talk in these situations, they would.
I will say, I'll give you a caveat there because if we haven't imposed, because I actually can't, I do this all the time, right? And I can't force somebody to speak. And so there can be situations where I'm trying to get a child to do something and and they do not have selective mutism. They've got a speech or a language disorder.
Right.
And I should say, a child who has selective mutism, correct me if I'm wrong on this, in the absence of other speech and language issues, or?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, sometimes I'll meet children with selective mutism who maybe have some, articulation issues. I think it's, a coincidence, I think that, we really try to tease apart whether or not there's something else going on, right? Whether it's um, an autism spectrum disorder, whether it's a speech language disorder, whether these child really does speak at home, right? Like we want to really make sure that we're sort of treating the right thing, right? Because if there's a child who is nonverbal, doesn't have language, doesn't speak at all, that's much more, that's a speech language issue.
Come to me.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
they're not being selectively mute. They are nonverbal. That's
Right.
different.
And
Right.
by the way, I mean, to your point, all children probably at some point, ignore their parent, teacher, therapist, right? And so what we're really looking at is children who go more than a month, right? So like more than the first month of school, let's say it's a new setting, it's a new environment, and they're still not speaking, right, in the way that's expected. There are some kids with selective mutism who will only speak to peers but cannot speak to adults, or can only speak to adults and can't speak to peers. There's really a wide range. My personal kids were so, I guess, severe. And that was, my first introduction into this world of selective mutism, that I'm almost grateful for it because it was so clear. There was no question what was going on. My first daughter was speaking full sentences at 15 months. And then, went to school when she was 2, and they questioned whether or not she had any language, whether or not she knew her colors, whether or not she, they questioned her with good reason, her affect. Kids with SM typically will have sort of like this deer in headlights look. Also, goes along with that fight, flight, or freeze response. There, a lot of kids with SM are very much frozen. And so there are so many components to it. And what I learned early on is that the most important thing you can do is really have that really open dialogue between the school and the parents so that they understand the child you're seeing, and as importantly, that you understand the child that they're seeing, because it's in that divide that you really come to understand what type of intervention this child needs, what type of struggle they're going through, and
I,
that's a big part of the process.
I often say to parents that inconsistency is the notable feature here. So no, obviously we're going to do some checking about what's happening at home and get good information. But what you were seeing with your daughter, for example, is somebody who is fully verbal at home and nonverbal at school.
Correct.
That is significant. It's not, you don't, you weren't coming to the teachers and saying, well, she's completely verbal at home, so get your shit together, right? Like, but so often, I think, number one, teachers are waiting that extra couple of weeks for those kids who are having trouble adjusting to school, or,
Slow to warm up kids. Yeah.
slow to warm up kids. And then teachers are often, and I do a fair number of teacher trainings, as you know, and so they hesitate to bring that information up to parents because it feels sticky.
Yeah.
And it can be a really hard conversation to have on both sides.
Yeah.
So your point is super well taken in terms of like, this has to happen sooner rather than later so that we know how to put this puzzle together and get treatment.
Right, absolutely. And, given my background, I probably jumped on it maybe a little faster than a lot of other parents would. But yeah, to your point, I've been on both sides of that table, being the professional talking to parents about potential challenges and being the parent, answering questions and trying to help, teachers figure out. And I should say, like, we were in like the most amazing, supportive, phenomenal preschool there was. And I'm so grateful because, each year the teachers really took the time to understand, what was going on with my kids and really sort of went through that journey with me. Selective mutism, it's not as rare as we tend to think, but it's certainly not common. So we were all going through something unique together. And one of the reasons I got into it professionally was, you know, this idea that people, parents, teachers tend to think like, oh, they'll grow out of it. Like, let's just give them time, but I think these kids are, they're suffering in a way, and I want parents to understand, and I want teachers to understand that there actually is really good evidence-based support. That again doesn't, you can't force somebody to talk, right? It's not about forcing them to talk, but it's about meeting the children where they are and helping them find their voice and helping them see that they can do hard things. And it is hard. I mean, these children who engage in treatment for SM and, most things, that children have to work on, they work really, really hard.
Yeah.
But I want parents and teachers to know that there often really can be successful treatment, a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a lot easier usually to treat when the kids are younger. When
Everything is.
you know, and I wanted there to be more understanding
Mhm.
about children with selective mutism, that it's not control and manipulation, that there is treatment, that the kids and the families don't have to, suffer and just think that like this is how it's going to be.
And
Um,
it's not something to push through, right? I mean, this is not, to your point about, these kids are suffering. And so we can like sort of leave them out on the ledge and heap shame and guilt and all of those things on them and let them suffer. Or we can get them some help and
yeah,
help them sort of be with themselves and grow through that so that they can be, the very excellent sort of
the best
bubbly
version of themselves. Yeah.
best
And
version of
like,
themselves.
and that's the thing, I work with a lot of parents and I understand it. They don't want to make their child into something that they're not. And I certainly never want to do that either. But it's really hard to be a child and not be able to get your needs met, in a classroom setting, not to be able to get more pretzels if you want more pretzels,
Mhm.
not be, to be too cold on the playground because you can't say that you need help putting your gloves on. And there's a lot of fear for parents of children with SM too. I know it for myself. One of my kids got bit on the playground one time, so much so through her jacket there was a mark, and she didn't cry in public, she didn't cry in front of other people, nobody knew what had happened, until she came home and she told me. But there's a lot of fear, what happens if this child with SM gets lost. More complicating factors, what if they have a food allergy, different things. And so we really want to give children the ability, right, to know that it's really hard, but this is something that they can do.
Mhm. Mhm. And is there a particular treatment for SM that is better than others, more evidence-based? I don't know anything about specific treatment methodologies.
Yeah, so there are a couple of, actually several now, different centers across the United States. Certainly starting with Child Mind Institute in New York and Kurtz Psychology. Dr. Stephen Kurtz really was the founder of a lot of these methodologies that have spread to other parts of the country. Thriving Minds in Michigan. There's the Smart Center in Philadelphia. And, they're all a little bit different. I'm only sort of expert in the approach that I take, which I really learned from Dr. Kurtz, who treated my children back when he was at the Child Mind Institute. And it really has a lot to do with being like really positive support, scaffolding, really success oriented. We talk about CDI, which is child directed intervention, and VDI, which is verbal directed interaction, and really sort of doing this dance between the two. I remember the first time I called up Dr. Kurtz about bringing my girls from Maryland to New York because I just wasn't finding the kind of support that I needed in the DC area. And he said, okay, well, first you have to bring them so we can make sure that they can talk to our therapist. And I said, well, how in the world is that going to work? They don't talk to anybody. And I remember to this day, he said, we're very good. And I have to tell you that my kids, who had never spoken to anybody outside of my house, in 20 minutes were talking to the therapist that he had paired us with.
Yeah.
I'm in touch with her to this day.
Yeah.
And and it's true. Like, you think there's this thing that your child can't do. And in fact, in the treatment that I got locally that, wasn't as SM specific as it should have been, I really started to think that, wow, my kid must be really messed up because we've been at this for so long and there's just no improvement. Um, and, then, I start to look a little bit deeper and look at, treatment that's specific to SM and not just to anxiety. And it's a different ballgame. And I see it, to this day with the families that I work with, over the past 10 years, I've been doing this. And they ask the same question that I asked, like, what do you mean they're going to talk to you? you know but it's this really positive approach, this really sort of gentle and sort of fading in approach, where we don't come at them immediately asking questions, right? We sort of observe them talking to the person that they're most comfortable with, usually their parent. And then we ease ourselves in and we don't necessarily say anything. And then we utilize these CDI, or, child directed interaction skills, in order to fade ourselves into the conversation, and eventually, sometimes even within that first session, fade the parent out and have the child continue talking to us. And I always say to parents, like, look, I'm so happy, like, when a child, who has SM talks to me, and I feel very successful, but ultimately it doesn't matter if the child, like, that's not the end goal, right? Like, I am not going to be the most important person in this child's life. Like, the reason I need them to talk to me is so that I can help make the bridge so that they can talk to the people who are really important in their lives. And we go through that process, slowly. I always say it's like baby steps up the mountain, right? Because we only want to approach a task that we feel really confident the child can be successful with. And if they're not successful, I always take the blame.
Yep.
Like, oh my gosh, we didn't practice that enough. We're going to keep working on that. Let's go over here and do this,
This
so
is
it's
huge,
never on
Meredith.
the kid.
So huge in terms of all, I mean, this is true of all intervention, and you know this, but making a just right challenge for the kids we see in therapy, because so many, any child, any person, but any child who's having trouble in their environment, right, means they're not a good match for the environment. Okay, so then we can do one of two things. We can start changing the skills, or we can change the environment, and we should probably do both, right? And to scaffold, to meet them where they are, and to build that bridge, a trusting bridge for them to come across with you, to create that just right challenge, is everything.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it looks like a chasm that you're going to fall into if you're a kid.
Yeah.
And they really need that broken down, just right challenge, and it needs to be challenging. I mean, I hear you saying, right, it has to be sort of continually, progressively more difficult so that we get to the end goal. We can't just sort of hang
That's
out in
right.
la la land all the time.
That's right.
Um,
And by the way, with younger kids especially, there are lots of stickers and there are lots of prizes. And, you know, I always tell parents, like, don't worry, your kid is not going to become dependent on stickers. You know, I have to say my younger one, when she started treatment, stickers didn't do it for her. And it was mini marshmallows and M&Ms. And I felt like just about the worst mother on the planet. And I could tell you now she's 12, she is not addicted to M&Ms or mini marshmallows. And she does plenty of things without, that reward system in place. But, and I remember Dr. Kurt saying, like, your kid's in a bind. You have to get them, through that bind, and this is how we're going to do it. And it's true, kids I start out with stickers or whatever other incentive, it's not too long before I don't have to use those stickers anymore, because talking becomes its own reward. They reap so much benefit from being able to be engaged in that way.
yeah, yeah. And that's really, if we go back to the beginning of this story, kids get very little from not speaking, and they get very, very much, a lot from
Yeah.
speaking. And so the motivation is baked in for
Right.
most, the vast majority
Yeah.
of kids.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, to come full circle, I mean, some guys need help.
Yes, exactly.
If people want to learn more about you, where should they find you?
They can find me in a variety of different places. I also work for Matan, which is a nonprofit organization based in New York that I actually founded 20 years ago, back in 2000. We work in the field of Jewish disability inclusion, so helping all Jewish communities be as inclusive as possible to anybody with any type of special need or disability. Somebody this morning said from baby to bubby, which I love.
Awesome. That's
Um,
really good.
so you can find me there at matankids.org. You can check out our website, or at growingmindstherapy.com, where I practice social work and specifically my selective mutism work. You can also find me on my own website, which is meredithpolsky.com. I write a lot of short picture stories, also known as social stories, but it's trademarked. So, but especially around the pandemic and things that children have been experiencing. And can I say one last thing, which is
Please.
that I also co-author a book series with my good friend Arlen Gaines. I have a question book series which tackles challenging topics, specifically for children with special needs. But as you and I both know, special education is just really good education, I like to say, and so really applicable to all children. So we have books about, it's not very uplifting, I'm warning you, but death, divorce, cancer, and coronavirus, which you'll find on any of the websites that I listed. But I'm always so happy to talk about selective mutism specifically. I just think, the more people who know about it, who understand it, the more we're going to be able to help these kids, their parents, their teachers, and everybody else in their lives who is affected by it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
We will link to all of those websites in the show notes, so to speak.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.